I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this Word in Your Ear podcast, videocast thing for which there is no name. Mark Ellen and I have been creating in this line since 2007. And if any of it has met with your approval, then please click to subscribe because it helps. Leave a comment because we like to hear from you, and maybe even consider becoming a Patreon supporter because then, well, you'll be one of us. Visit patreon.com/wordinyourear for details.
Welcome to this and to the unique story of Talking Heads. Has there ever been a group like them? Their backgrounds, their music, a career apparently conducted on their own terms, all plain sailing? Or was it? We both enjoyed Burning Down the House, the new book by Jonathan Gould, very much, and we're joined by him now from New York. Jonathan, lovely to see you.
Lovely to be here. Electronically, at any rate.
Electronically, exactly. So when did you first become connected to Talking Heads and their music? When did that happen?
Well, so I'm 73 years old, the same age as them. I grew up in New York City. I'm a New York City native, and I spent most of the 1970s and early 1980s as a professional musician. So I was very aware of them pretty much from the beginning, I would say, certainly before they made their first album.
Who were you playing with, actually? Can we just ask anybody we would have heard of?
A bunch of people. Rory Block was one person that I played with.
Right,
you probably heard of her.
You were a drummer, weren't you?
Yes, I was and am a drummer.
And am, indeed.
And I mainly did two things. I mainly did studio work. Back in the era when studios employed large numbers of drummers before the invention of the Linn drum computer, which was, there was that. And also during that period, not to get off on me, but I was also working with a cohort of musicians that I'd associated myself along the way, trying to put together a great rock and roll band. And as a result, one of my attractions to writing about Talking Heads is that they did the thing that I spent quite a bit of time trying to do. In my opinion, we came close a couple of times, but they did it. And that's the sort of the initial kind of admiration that I have for them.
What was the thing that you were trying to do that they achieved?
To put together, when I say a great rock band, a band with its roots in black music, because my whole generation of white musicians was schooled on rhythm and blues, I would say, and a band that wrote original material. And the other thing that we were trying to do, because all of the bands that I loved, or most of them, and this is not true of Talking Heads, had more than one significant singer in them. I mean, the influences on me were groups like the Beatles and the Band. The idea that what could be taking place in music is a conversation between people. And which both of those groups sort of specialized in many ways. So anyway, that's what I was trying to do back then. But I was very aware of their music and also very aware of the way in which they were completely different from everything else that seemed to be happening in that nascent downtown music scene of the mid-70s.
Well, I wanted to...
So before we get to that, I want to just talk about New York for a moment, because one of the points you make in the book is that prior to kind of this downtown scene, New York had kind of drifted off the map, hadn't it, really, as a major music center in America?
Well, as a creator, I mean, obviously it was a music center. There were, endless recording studios there. Many of the major labels had their official corporate headquarters there. But in terms of in the 1960s, when you go back and look at what actually came out of New York, there wasn't that much. America until then had been this amazing place of regional music scenes, whether it was, New Orleans or Memphis and then even Los Angeles sort of began as a regional music scene. It was an R&B center, in the 50s before it became a major recording center. So part of what was interesting about what happened in New York in the 70s was indeed this sense that I call it this kind of cosmopolitan provincialism or provincial cosmopolitanism. Here's this world city, but here's this kind of local phenomenon that's emerged from kind of a sort of sketchy section of that world city.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about that, because it's one of the things that I found most interesting about the book is that you, obviously, as an American, have a view of where all these bands kind of came from and what kind of people they were. The Ramones, Talking Heads, they're all different. Whereas Brits, they were all exotic Americans who somehow sprang out the Bowery or something. It wasn't like that at all, was it?
No, it wasn't. I start the book with a quote from E.B. White about the nature of the population of New York City. And he talks about the natives, that would be people like me. He talks about the commuters, that would be people like the Ramones, who lived in Queens. And then he talks about the settlers. And the settlers are the people who, for generations on end, have been coming to New York because of its not just its reputation, its reality as the cultural capital of America in many, many ways. Coming to New York to make their fortune in the arts in one way or another. Talking Heads were somewhat unique in that New York scene in that they were settlers. They came from elsewhere. David grew up in Baltimore. Chris Franz grew up in Pittsburgh. Tina Weymouth grew up all over because she was a classic military brat, as they call themselves. And Jerry Harrison grew up in Milwaukee. They came from elsewhere. And what that meant in some ways is that they came to New York with a package of romantic feelings about what New York might be that people like me who grew up here, I mean, I have some of that, but, part of the whole stance of the native New Yorker is to take it all for granted. It's like, what else is new, right? This sort of thing. And that's true of, so they were different geographically in terms of their origins. And of course, they were also different in terms of their class background, which should resonate with you Brits, obviously, in that sense. And
because we invented it.
Well, yes, you did. You invented it and perfected it, right?
But as Dave was saying, we were never really aware of that. No, and I do think that's fascinating, that there's this, she's, as you say, the daughter of a kind of vice admiral of the Navy, I think.
A flag admiral of the Navy.
Flag admiral.
Very high-ranking.
Oh, is that even more?
Okay. Jerry's father, I think, was an advertising executive. Jerry went to Harvard. They all came from these, what we would call posh backgrounds.
Exactly.
Actually. So, and there they are at CBGB, singing songs which entire verses are in French, like Psycho Killer. And you're trying to imagine what Johnny Ramone is thinking about all this,
Well, it's, as we all know, it has always been difficult. It always was difficult to figure out what Johnny Ramone was thinking about as far as that goes. But everybody there. And, part of the romanticization of that scene, and of course, I'm familiar with this from having written about the Beatles. I'm familiar with the romanticization of the scene in Liverpool, which in some ways was the archetype of the idea of what could happen in some sort of out of the way place. And I'm describing the Bowery of New York as an out of the way place in that sense, because that's sort of the way that New Yorkers regarded it. But there's always let's put it this way: the camaraderie is always largely in retrospect, right? Later on, Chris and Tina particularly professed a deep sort of affection for the Ramones. They toured with the Ramones, not with Talking Heads. Well, in the beginning with Talking Heads, but later on in the late '80s, they toured with the Ramones in a kind of sort of CBGBs revival tour and this sort of thing. At the time, though, they felt they were sort of shunned by the scene there, as Tina put it, because we didn't dress like the New York Dolls, right? And they didn't. I mean, from the very beginning, they were marked as these oddballs. And I think they were also marked as, there's a wonderful sort of episode in Chris's book where he describes getting cut dead by Patti Smith, who comes up to, or he introduces himself to Patti Smith. That's Chris's way. He's very gregarious. And Patti Smith says, "Oh, you're that art school band. I wish my parents were rich enough to send me to art school."
Ouch.
Right. Ouch, exactly.
It's what we would call in Britain chippy. That kind of attitude.
But I think, just going back to the background again, and also to the art school approach, I suppose, the fact that they were from well-heeled families, do you think that contributed to the fact that they didn't feel as much pressure to make commercial music? Because
no question about it.
Because they had a fallback, didn't they? If it didn't work out, they could go and get
I too come from a pretty privileged background. Okay, Early in the book, I make a distinction between the art school kids in Britain and the art school kids in America, right? As we all know, art school kids, or not as we all know, but arts kids who went to art school, that whole generation of art school dropouts for the most part that populated British rock and roll in the 1960s, beginning with John Lennon, but the list goes on and on. These were kids who were sent to art school for the most part as a last resort. They failed their O levels, and it's like, what are we going to do with you? And well, this is one thing that you could do. And the Keith Richards and the John Lennons, who probably were not that gifted as visual artists to begin with, were sort of shunted off there. In the U.S., it was a very different thing. Most of the art schools were either very high-powered, sort of professionalized art schools like RISD or Maryland Institute College of Art, or they were in big universities that were hard to get into and cost a lot of money. So, getting back to your point, having written about the Beatles and having written about Otis Redding, one of the things that I understood about them from the very beginning was there was no plan B. Paul McCartney had some A levels, so he probably would have been might have wound up as a teacher. I can imagine Paul as a very popular middle school teacher, this sort of thing, right? Yeah. Lennon, I don't know what would have happened, right? Otis, plan B was working as a manual laborer, to be perfectly blunt about it, in the South, if his career hadn't worked out. But with Talking Heads, this was a choice. And if it didn't work out, all of them, I think, would have gone on to have some other kind of career, maybe arts related, maybe not. David Byrne, for a number of reasons, I think was the one of them who might not have had many other possibilities aside from enormous success in the arts. He was and is enormously talented, but his a lot of aspects of his, for lack of a better term, sort of social interaction with the world might have inhibited him in pretty significant ways from achieving the sort of success that he certainly wanted.
All right. So all these bands, because we read about them in Britain through the lens of the Melody Makers, New York correspondent, or the NMEs or whatever, and we're also acutely aware of these places like CBGB or Max's Kansas City, and we always thought these were really happening scenes, thriving, full of tons of people queuing around the block. Of course, in your account, that wasn't really the case, was it?
Well, certainly not at the beginning. When it became institutionalized, it was. But no, in the beginning, it was a bunch of people from the neighborhood. And on some nights, there'd be 3 or 4 people there. Yes. And some nights, there'd be a dozen people there. It started as a wino bar. And Hilly Crystal, who established the club, who had a significant background in running clubs, it took him about 5 years really, to figure out what to do with the place. It was a biker bar, a wino bar. The bikers, got their recreational violence by throwing the winos out when they got too drunk. This sort of thing. No, but it was not a happening scene, as is always the case with these places, until it was a happening scene, and then of course. People flocked to it for a number of years and continued to even long after. Punk became sort of a stereotype, I guess.
Yeah.
You were talking about them being kind of shunned by some of the other groups for not looking like the New York Dolls or whatever. I thought it was a really interesting bit in the book. You talk about the importance of the Modern Lovers, because the Modern Lovers were so unconventional. They didn't dress like rock stars at the time, didn't behave like them, they didn't look like them, their music wasn't like them, and they were a big influence, weren't they?
Yeah, I think for several reasons. There are a lot of analogies between Jonathan Richman and David Byrne, in beginning with just the oddball dimension of both of them. They're appealing but peculiar people, I guess. And David back in the day was extremely peculiar. There's no other way to describe it. Part of the fascination of the group was how odd he seemed in that sense. But Jonathan Richman, who was, one of the great disciples of the Velvet Underground, on the one hand, to the point where I mentioned in the book that he at one point he literally slept on Lou Reed's couch when he was working as a busboy at Max's Kansas City. That's when Jonathan was. But the odd thing about his appreciation of the Velvet Underground was that he was adamantly opposed to the use of recreational drugs, which is something that people tend to associate with the Velvet Underground, right? And he was also, there was this kind of innocence about him. All of the themes of violence and debauchery and all of that sort of thing. There was something almost puritanical about Jonathan Richman in the way in what he wrote about and this strange appreciation that he had for the suburbs of Boston. His great song Roadrunner, which is a kind of love song to suburban life. All of this. So yeah, again, it's important to remember that the modern lovers were not successful when they were together. On the contrary, it's important for people to remember that the Velvet Underground weren't successful when they were together.
True.
Their second album was a commercial disaster. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. And but that's sort of one of the ingredients of a great cult band is that they're not popular.
Yes. They should ideally be really unpopular, shouldn't they? Really,
of course, right. I mean, Brian Eno's great statement, and I think it's absolutely true about the Velvet Underground, was that I don't know what the figure that he said, but he said only about their first album, only 10,000 people bought that record, but every one of them started a band of his own.
Formed a band. Exactly that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just a word about the kind of people often talk about the New York scene of the 70s and the connection between that and the real estate market that you could afford to, in those days, go and live in a loft in areas that are now presumably occupied entirely by bankers. Is that the case?
That's exactly right, and it was critical. We can talk all about the grit of New York and all of that sort of thing. The most important aspect, the reason this was able to happen when it did, and we're not just talking about music here, we're talking about the development of a whole downtown art scene.
Yes.
Involving rock and roll, involving avant-garde classical music, involving film, involving dance, involving the whole gamut of culture and the visual arts in a very big way. Taking root in a place that had once been a light industrial manufacturing neighborhood where nobody lived for the most part. When all of those jobs went away over the course of the late 1960s and early 1970s, suddenly Lower Manhattan, which had been this thriving manufacturing district until it wasn't, was filled with empty loft space or almost empty loft space. When Talking Heads moved into their place on Christie Street, which is in the heart of the Lower East Side, I think their rent was $289 a month, right, for a probably 2,000 square foot loft. I mean, to really do the statistics there, the sort of most menial jobs like the ones that they held in New York paid $250 an hour. Okay. So, they were all of them making like $400, $500 a month, which made it very easy for them to afford that kind of rent. And still have money to live on.
It's just exactly what happened in London with punk rock, actually. The kind of derelict parts of particularly West London, which were afforded squats for people to live in and be able to rehearse in.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to pick up on one other point, which I don't think everyone was fully aware of, actually, was that David Byrne wasn't ever sure about the idea of a girl being in the group. And when he accepted the girl being in the group, he made a re-audition, didn't he? Tell us that story.
So it's a complicated story because there are a couple of different versions of it. Tina has told this story, began telling this story to the British press, as a matter of fact. I think probably to Nick Kent or somebody like that in the late 70s or early 80s. I'm not sure how true it actually is. Okay. But anyway, her story is that when the Heads were decided finally, they resisted the idea of signing a record contract on the grounds that they weren't ready. Talk about people who have some sense of choice.
Yes,
yeah.
You don't hear that about many working class British bands, that they held off the record company for a year or two. But anyway, and they were right, by the way, about that. So when they indeed decided to added Jerry Harrison to the group, beefed up their sound and decided that it was time for them to record. The story goes that on one occasion, David asked Tina in some way or another to audition for the band. The problems with this story, from my point of view, are this. First of all, Chris tells a version of it that it happened several months earlier, not when they decided to sign with Sire Records. That it happened several months earlier, and his description of it is that he walked in on a scene in which David, at a rehearsal studio, in which David and Tina were already there. David had said to Tina that he was going to play some things, and he wanted her to come up with some bass parts, right, for them. And Tina, in Chris's telling, interpreted this as an audition. Now, I've played in a lot of bands, okay? And the idea that I'm going to play you something and I want you to come up with a part, that's not necessarily an audition. That's sometimes saying, can you come up with a bass part?
Yeah, that's work.
Yeah, it is. That's right.
And it's particularly true because, early on, David wrote Tina's bass lines. I mean, Tina is associated with the iconic bass line of Psycho Killer. I'm pretty sure that at the point that arrangement rather of that song was made, David was basically, showing Tina how to construct her bass lines. So this might have been related to in some ways him saying to her, it's, okay, it's time for you to start coming up with your own stuff. Let's see how you can do, okay? But the other things about this story that I find rather strange is, he's many things, but he's not an idiot, okay? The idea, at that point, Tina Weymouth was one of the from a record company's point of view and from a fan point of view, one of the sort of most important elements. The fact that this band had a female instrumentalist playing a rhythm section instrument, especially.
Oh, yeah.
Incredibly important.
Playing a huge bass that she deliberately bought the biggest bass you could find.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of that, the idea that let's forget about David Byrne. The idea that Seymour Stein, the president of their record label, was just going to sort of take in stride the possibility that they're going to replace their bass player, probably with a guy, right? Which would have changed the whole kind of the whole image of the band. But even more weirdly, did David actually think that, Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth at that time were romantically involved? In fact, I think they were married by the time this whole thing took place.
Yes, what would that have done to the...
Chris was just going to say, oh, you want to replace Tina in the band? That's fine with me.
I'm going to kick your wife out.
Fired your wife.
It's so funny. There's some early reviews, which are amazing, actually. They're just instantly, the critics tend to be loving. But there was somebody, I can't remember who it was, it was an NME critic, who didn't really like the band, but it still has to say, but Tina Weymouth is gorgeous,
Yeah. Wasn't that something?
They were well aware of the value of having her on board,
But it's very curious, kind of. I can't think of another band like it. I mean, you got Fleetwood Mac where you had two married couples, but
they're married. Right. I mean, literally married to the band. Yeah.
But it's kind of odd, isn't it? Because is that the long story of Talking Heads that really Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz are one person as far as the band is concerned?
It is sort of that way, yes.
And David Byrne is this difficult to deal with leader songwriter. Jerry Harrison is kind of honest broker musician, probably doesn't get involved. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I think that Jerry in an interesting way was kind of critical. Most successful bands have a balancer somewhere there.
Yeah.
In the case of the Beatles, it's a little hard. In the case of the Beatles, one would say that George Harrison was the balancer. Okay, but then Ringo too, when he came on board, right? Because there was a lot to balance there, after all. Yeah. Talent-wise, there was a great deal to balance. I think Jerry did play the role of a balancer. Early on, he and Jerry had an easier time dealing with David, because after all, Jerry had dealt with Jonathan Richman.
Yes.
And
he had. Also, I'd never realized that he was the oldest and that David Byrne was the youngest, which is an interesting dynamic as well, actually. So
by slight amounts, but they were all.
Those things matter, though, when you're in your 20s.
Yes, they do. And listen, for Americans, I don't care. I went to Cornell, okay? Harvard matters for Americans.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It creates a certain aura. Let's just put it that way.
So, if you look at the long story of the Talking Heads, Tina and Chris, being one person, really wish they were back together. Is that fair?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean,
but they can't make it happen.
No, they can't make it happen, and it's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen for good reasons. I mean, listen, there was a lot of artistic integrity to this group. They did not in a sort of self-destructive way, but they did turn down opportunities that would have paid well, that wasn't what they wanted to do, that didn't have to do with the way they wanted to present themselves. And first of all, there was a long period, it's probably still in existence, of bad blood between Chris and Tina and David. Tina was enormously critical of David in the press. I know very well that Chris and Tina are not that thrilled with my book. These things come back to one as through.
Why don't they like it?
Is that on the basis of having read it or just not liking the idea of it?
Well, that I don't know, because I don't know exactly what their stance is. But Tina is one of these people, and both of you have worked as journalists. I haven't worked as a journalist in any meaningful sense, but I'm very familiar with this phenomenon of people who give interviews, right? And then get quoted in articles and come off in a certain way that when they see their words in print, they don't like, and claim that, the journalist sort of made it all up or something like that. I mean, we have that phenomenon on a rather grand scale taking place in the United States right now, but let's not get into that. Right? But you know what I'm talking about. So Tina would say these things about David, and people would print them, and then she would
say, "I never said that."
Right.
Exactly.
Or, it was a hatchet job, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it created a lot of bad blood. But going back to the very beginning, because they were recognized so quickly and written up in the press so quickly, these were not the three of them, Chris, Tina, and David. They had not been close friends at art school or anything like that. Chris and Tina were. David had dropped out of art school. He was in sort of in orbit around the world of Rhode Island Institute, Rhode Island School of Design. And when they moved in together in New York, they were not close friends. But the experience of, first of all, rehearsing together so intensively, putting this band together, and getting immediate recognition and a form of immediate success. 6 weeks after their first gig, they're on the cover of the Village Voice. The three of them, this sort of thing. They had no choice but to form a relationship. Very likely, otherwise what would have happened is they wouldn't have had so much success. They probably would have drifted apart. Maybe somebody would have joined another band, this sort of thing. But because it all happened so quickly, they were sort of thrust together. And the tensions between them and the sort of, let's just say the tensions between them emerged, over the course of a professional career with all of those pressures and all of those ambitions.
Because you also have, in the midst of all this, you have the Tom Tom Club. What was that all about? Because that's, that still hangs on, doesn't it? That music.
Sure.
And also, I'm not sure I can think of an offshoot group, a splinter group, ever who've been that successful, actually. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? But why did they do it in the first place? Was there something, the point they wanted to prove?
Yeah, I think it was. I think, first of all, it was formed, it was formed in reaction to the fact that the band took a kind of sabbatical after Remain in Light, and which was in some ways a musical high point, but was also a high point of tension in the band. It was represented the end of Brian Eno's involvement with the band. There were issues over the credits on the album, this sort of thing. In many ways, David Byrne and Brian Eno sort of bonded creatively during the making of that record, and then sort of as these two very talented, very egotistical people, kind of sort of forgot about everybody else.
I bet. So I've got a new friend over here. And
Yeah,
I've got an egghead over here I can spend my time with. Yeah,
exactly. So
Yeah,
anyway, so that after that record, David decided to go off and make a solo album, which with Twyla Tharp actually. Eno and Byrne had already made a solo album, but it was not one that they sang on. They used sampled
Yeah.
vocals for that. But anyway, Jerry Harrison decided to make a solo album. And so Chris and Tina went to Seymour Stein and said, we'd like to make a solo album. And Stein's attitude was, I've already got sort of 3 projects here that are sort of Talking Heads solo albums. I don't really think I can sign you to that. Chris Blackwell, however, at Island Records, offered for them to come down to Compass Point Studios and make a single. And if that went well, maybe they could make an album. And so Tom Town Club was conceived as a deliberately, one might almost say, anti-intellectual, anti-aesthetic sort of alternative to Talking Heads. Both Chris and Tina said, Chris particularly said in the press, we're sick of this reputation of us being intellectuals, being these eggheads and all of that. And of course, if the goal was to dispel that image, they did a phenomenal job.
They did.
They did.
And it must have secretly irritated the hell out of David Byrne.
It must have.
That's a genuine number, a huge record. That
Of
But
course.
also the amount of fun they were having and how they were a dance band too. Whereas
Yes.
by the end, Talking Heads, who started off as a dance band, was very much, navel gazing, chin stroking.
Although I was going to say that, one of the things I was going to ask about that, the dancing is a big thing with Talking Heads, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
With David Byrne and Remain in Line, and
Stop Making Sense.
and Stop Making Sense and all that. We say at the beginning of Stop Making Sense, which we've all seen millions of times, where it starts off with the boombox and it slowly builds up, and next thing you know, you're looking at Sly and the Family Stone. You know what I mean? Go on.
Let's go back to the beginning for 1 second here, okay? The quality that set them apart from the very beginning in the downtown New York rock and roll scene, which became known as a punk rock scene, but it went even before it was known as that. The thing that set them apart from the very beginning was that for all of David's strangeness, for all of this disquieting sort of stage presence that he had, this was a band, like most of the great bands of the 1960s, that was grounded in rhythm and blues, okay? When Jerry Harrison joined the band, they all had the same thought, which was suddenly they had the same instrumentation as Booker T and the MGs.
Yeah. Can't be bad.
And so this was something that was there from the beginning. And as they got good, because that's what happens with diligent people when they play their instruments day after day, night after night, and they got good pretty quickly. I'm not virtuosic, but good at their at playing. This dance element, this groove that they had, became more and more prominent. And in their work with Eno, particularly, he introduced them to Afropop, to Fela Kuti and King Study Ade and people like that, which was part of Eno's classically sort of cosmopolitan taste in this way, and they picked up on that in a very big way. The interesting irony about that, of course, I was very familiar with those bands, Fela and so on and so forth. What I learned writing the book was that, in many ways, the main influence on them was James Brown. Because when James Brown came to Africa in the late 60s and early 70s, all of those guys were, he basically showed them how to translate sort of traditional African approach to drumming and rhythm to modern electric instruments in that way. But anyway, so Talking Heads progressively became more and more involved with dance music. Unlike the punk scene, they were not sort of adamantly opposed to disco. Sure, there were things about disco that were mechanical. There were things about disco that were overtly commercial. But the groove, on the other hand, was a very significant sort of dimension of the music in that way. So certainly from 1980 on, Talking Heads were a dance band. And what they wound up doing, of course, was importing some of the great sort of dance band musicians of their time. I mean, Bernie Worrell, along with Herbie Hancock and Stevie Wonder, was the great virtuoso of the clavinet, right? Of the funk sort of keyboard playing in that way. And they hired him on to play on their records and also live. Another interesting side trip that they took was with Adrian Belew, who, I think we're all old enough to remember when Adrian Belew first came on the scene with those kind of animalistic sort of sounds that he was able to make from his guitar. It was a completely new thing. It didn't even sound like it was as if he'd taken this one dimension of Jimi Hendrix's playing and turned it into a whole universe in that way. So, they hired Adrian Belew to play with them on their records and live. And so the expansion of their whole musical vocabulary, their whole instrumental vocabulary was very important to this. And then David, being David, he had an affair with Twyla Tharp, one of the great choreographers of her generation. He worked with Tony Basil, who was a great dancer.
Of course.
On the whole sort of Soul Train kind of circuit in that way. And David did the same thing he did with music. He schooled himself in movement and came up with an equivalently odd, equivalently distinctive, equivalently sort of dynamic version of how to move on stage that suited his personality. And
it's so true, because for all the blackness of the rhythm section, it's still the whitest dancing in a way. Don't you?
Well,
You
of
think
course it
it's
is.
terribly kind of anxious and unrelaxed and not at all fluid. It's gymnastic.
No, absolutely, and self-awarely so, because look, I write in the book, almost every white rock and roll sort of performer of several generations, certainly the 60s and 70s generation, based their stage presence on what I describe as the self-assured physicality of the African American role models, right? What Otis looked like on stage, what James Brown looked like. These were people who commanded the stage, right? Byrne was very aware from the very beginning that he was not somebody who was going to command the stage.
Didn't quite tick all those boxes.
It wasn't
Geography
gonna-
teacher.
Uptight, preppy.
Right. It wasn't going to work that way. And to his credit, rather than sort of trying to transform himself into that, he transformed himself actually into somebody who did wind up commanding the stage, but with a set of moves that nobody had ever seen before, but which were, as in a strange way, as self-assured as anything that James Brown did. Not as graceful, but as self-assured.
So there's David Byrne still to this day putting out. He's got a newer record coming out
Yes.
now, I think, or something. And
I think today. I think it's released today.
there you go. And it will no doubt be very widely applauded, as they tend to be, but it won't set the world on fire.
No.
So why is it, do you think, that whereas if the Talking Heads were to get back together again, which they, as you said, they won't, but if they were to do an Oasis-style tour, they would sell a lot of tickets, I would have thought.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Whereas David Byrne won't. Why is that?
Well, I think a couple of things. David has changed in many, many ways over the years, in ways that I think are to his credit, in the sense that I think he's a much more relaxed, much more sort of engaged person. We haven't spoken about this, but this is my book is the first time that anybody has written about him and about Talking Heads with some awareness of the fact that David is self-diagnosed as being on what we call the Asperger's spectrum. That is, saying high functioning autism. In the time that he was growing up, there was no such thing. It had not been named. It was not recognized that there is such a thing as high functioning autism. I'm mainly interested in it, and I write about it mainly as it relates to his creative sensibility, rather than his ability to get along with other people and things like that, which it certainly had some effect on. I'm interested in the originality that it seemed to bring to a lot of his thinking about music and about words and so on and so forth. But anyway, that dimension of him, that's sort of epitomized, that's sort of exaggerated by the psycho killer dimension of him, right? I mean, this is a person who first came on the scene singing a song about a pathological killer, after all, and while looking like, sort of the meekest man in the world, right? That whole dimension, that sort of tortured psychology that he put out early on, that's all faded away. And I think it's faded largely from his life too. I would never presume to say that somebody has an easy life, but I think that aspects of his life are more integrated and easier now. That's not necessarily conducive to making great art, I hate to say. We see this time and again, where success, the comforts of success, sort of take the edge away from edgy performers. And in Byrne's case, nobody was an edgier performer than he was. Paul McCartney has sailed through, this incredible career that he's had, occasionally to this day coming out with something that, can make your jaw drop. Not the way he once did, but nevertheless, every once in a while, Paul does something on a record that I just go, oh my God, listen to that, right? But he was never about edge in that sense, right? And I think that performers like Byrne or artists like Byrne, if they lose their edge over time, it can detract from their art. And so many of David's solo records that he's come out with since Talking Heads, most of them have a couple of really good songs on them, but nothing like the consistency, nothing like the variety of what he did with Talking Heads. And again, it's also because he's in charge of the show. And when the whole idea behind rock bands from the beginning was this certain kind of clash of personalities.
Yes. Yeah.
It is, but also in their case, I think they're one of those not that common cases where the main warmth of that group, I think, didn't come from him, funnily enough. I think it came from the rest of the group. And
Yes.
he was the kind of complicated, tortured soul at the beginning,
exactly
through
right.
whom, the prism through whom you kind of entered the idea of Talking Heads. But without particularly Tina and Chris Frantz, and Jerry as well, they were all warm, likable,
Yes.
kind of cooperative human beings. And I think him on his own doesn't, I don't think he has that warmth and appeal, actually.
Yeah, no, I
Much as I
don't-
love his music, but
Yeah, I don't disagree with you about that. Now,
if I see he's given an interview, I don't beat a path to get a copy of it and read it.
Yes, no, it's true. I mean, he's
Although he's become a very good chat show guest, hasn't he?
Yes, he has.
I've seen him do some really good performances.
I know, and if you go back and look at the clips from interviews with him on American Bandstand and things like that, where he can barely speak.
It was agonizing, whereas now he has worked out a way of doing it.
No, he
Definitely.
has. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me is if they did get back together, which clearly they're not going to do, then the size of those audiences, the number of tickets they'd sell would dictate that they have to play really big venues. And I don't think they're suited to that at all, because big venues are mostly about spectacle.
No, I agree.
And that just doesn't suit what the Talking Heads are about. It's a very intimate experience, isn't it? You made a really good point in the book about the difference between American punk and British punk. And American punk is about precision and emotion, and British punk's about kind of speed and volume. Yes. And I think that's an important part of it. I don't think that'd work in a big. The biggest venues they ever played were 12,000 seaters, weren't they? 10,
Yeah, I mean, they played a couple of stadium things with the Police and stuff like that, and festivals and things like that. But no, they there's an intimacy about their music. I mean, and that's. There are a few bands that have an intimacy to their music that can put it across in a big way. It would be. You have to remember also the other three have not really played out in a very, very long time in terms of this. The speculation about the idea of them reuniting. David has had a very active musical career.
Yes.
Jerry worked mainly as a producer during most of although he's been touring recently also with Adrian Belew, as a matter of fact, and I've seen a couple of those shows, and they're quite entertaining, in that sense. But it's not like I think these reunions are a really bad idea. I think the odd thing about them is, did we ever think that the Rolling Stones were going to go on for another 60 or 70 years? I mean, did that ever occur to us?
No.
And probably if the Stones had broken up, say around maybe 1975, kind of at the height of their powers, the way the Beatles did, that we'd see them in a very different way now.
Yeah. That's true.
It's interesting too that I think that it's very unusual actually that it's a film as much as, if not more than, the albums that's their great high point for a lot of people. That Stop Making Sense is actually the most important thing that they did, rather than any particular album.
No,
it's
I think
unusual.
that's true. And it's a masterpiece. I mean, I say that not because I want to talk up the band and talk up my book. It was recognized from the moment it came out as one of the purest, most unusual performance films that had ever been done. You know, I love the fact that it was released the same year when that film was being filmed. Rob Reiner was in the process of making This Is Spinal Tap.
There you go. And now he's doing it again.
And now he's doing it again.
Exactly.
Right? But, you know, to me, This Is Spinal Tap was the film that laid to rest that whole type of rock documentary film with the backstage interviews.
It's not as simple as that. He's doing it again 40 years later.
I know.
I know.
These things are more powerful than all of us.
I know. But it's such a good book. I think one of my favourite bits is where the Talking Heads and Ramones are on tour.
Oh, God.
I think in France, in Europe anywhere. They're in the same tour bus in 76, 77. And how Johnny Ramone is disgusted by the fact that they get off the bus and they're always talking to the natives in French. I just thought that was the best kind of example of two bands being sort of not terribly well suited to each other. But it's a fantastic book, isn't it, Dave? We
There
love
you go.
That would make a great
Burning
movie.
Down the House, the Talking Heads, and the New York scene that transformed them. And by Jonathan Gould. Jonathan, lovely to talk to you. Thanks so much.